and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Contracting. I am Leona Charles, CEO of SPC Business Consulting, where we do all things government contracts. You can find us on just about any social media site you can imagine, Adventures in Contracting or SPC Business Consulting. So today's episode, I want to talk about the memo that came out that kind of set Washington on fire, and we are talking about Memo M2513, the temporary pause of agency grant, loan, and other financial assistance programs. And then I want to talk a little bit about where I would think the administration is coming from and the complaint that was filed in answer to it and the government's response to it. So let's dive right in. So the memo basically states that on January 30th, every agency was to stop funding all or temporarily pause funding for all activities related to obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance and other relevant agency activities that may be implicated by the executive orders, but not limited to financial assistance for foreign aid, NGOs, DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. So they're basically saying no new awards, stop current awards, wind down any programs, nothing but reporting and compliance. Don't pay for anything having to do with anything affected by these EOs. The EOs are going to be listed in the comments. I'm not going to read them out one by one. You guys can do that yourselves. But basically, that's what they're saying. Just a pause to anything and everything having to do with anything touched by these EOs. So typically when memos are issued, they have to have an underlying legal authority attached to them. The only authority that was presented in this memo, in Memo M2513, was Acting Director Vase, and I'm probably butchering his name, I apologize, stated the only basis for submitting this memo was his belief that financial assistance should be dedicated to advancing administrative priorities, and that the use of federal resources to advance Marxist equity, transgenderism, and the Green New Deal social engineering policies is a waste of taxpayer dollars that does not improve the day-to-day lives of those that we serve. So on January 29th, an administrative stay was issued stopping the memo from going into effect because of the chaos that inevitably ensued, and because it was so broad and overreaching that there was reason to believe that it would cause considerable harm. So they did the stay, and then you had the press secretary put out a tweet that said, yes, the memo was rescinded, but the policy stands. So a stay was given because she made that statement. Here's what I think, or where I would think if I were in the administration, and I'm trying to put myself in their shoes so that I can kind of do a decent analysis of this. Here's where I think that they're going, or where they're kind of trying to track. So it is that sentence that says, where he says that it does not improve the day-to-day lives of those we serve, and it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. So that sentence, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars, leads me to termination of convenience. That's where I immediately go with that. And for those of us in GovCon space, we know it as a T for C, and it's FAR 49.502. And basically what it says is that the government can terminate a contract in whole or in part if they determine that it's in the government's interest. And what's in the government's interest? Well, that's really subjective, and it's really up to the contracting officer. I think this would have held more water if they would have had contracting officers submit to them that this is not in the best interest of the public, and prevent a justification in findings or something of that sort that corroborated that point of view with some some other legal basis. I think that would have been, then you could have argued that's a proper T for C and there's really nothing else to do. And then at that point, the memo could have leaned on 52.232-18, which is the availability of funds, which basically says there's no funding for this. If there's a T for C, there's no funding. So we can't continue to let work go on these programs because, the COs have presented us with cases that say this is not in the public's best interest because of A, B, and C. They have underlined it with some legal precedent. We concur. We're going to shut off funding. So there's no availability of funds. That would have made more sense to me because at that point, you can approach it as risk management and portfolio management and fiduciary responsibility, which is a contracting officer's responsibility to have. The complaint that was registered was equally interesting. The basis of their complaint was basically that the memo was unlawful because, like I said, there was no legal underpinning to the memo. It was basically he said my feelings, basically. This is why I don't want to do this because it's my feelings. So there was no legal underpinning for it. So they say it's unlawful. Additionally, it's arbitrary, it's capricious, and it's an abuse of discretion. So I think arbitrary and capricious, that's fine, but I don't really think that those are the big ones that are going to help them out. I think what's going to help them out is the abuse of discretion. And I think that for a couple of reasons. One is if we look at the Youngstown framework, right? And the Youngstown framework came out of President Truman's time, where he used an executive order to seize control of steel mills. So the opinions in that case were that there is a 3-part test for analyzing conflicts between presidential and congressional powers. And they basically established what's called a zone of twilight, where Justice Robert Jackson put it, Congress and the president may have concurrent authority, and at their lowest ebb is when a president acts against Congress. So considering that Congress has already appropriated the funds for these programs, what Trump finds himself in right now is that kind of zone of twilight where Congress has expressed their wishes, which is to fund those programs, and he's decided that I don't like those wishes and I want to defund them. And so the president now is at the lowest ebb according to Justice Jackson's zone of twilight. One of the other things that came out of the majority opinion was that when the president acts pursuant to an express or implied authorization of Congress, his authority is at its maximum. And it includes all that he possesses in his own right, plus everything that Congress can delegate. But when a president acts in absence of a congressional grant or denial of authority, he can only rely on his independent powers. This is where I think that they might have got him, because depending on if he has to depend on his independent powers, if we do agree that they're in this zone of twilight, and he has to depend on his independent authority, right, based on Article 2 in the Constitution, the Constitution limits his functions in the lawmaking process to merely recommending laws he thinks wise and vetoing laws he thinks bad. The Constitution is neither silent nor equivocal about who shall make laws which the president is to execute. The Constitution says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. So Article 2 of the Constitution is very clear. It says the only people that can make laws are Congress. The president's job is to faithfully execute the laws that come from Congress. And this is where I think this complaint is going to succeed. It will succeed if they rely on the separation of powers for the executive branch, and if they really kind of hone on this zone of twilight, which really is kind of like the perfect example for this particular power struggle, right? Because if you hold the zone of twilight to be true, and the president's power is at its weakest when he disagrees with Congress, then you've kind of served this complaint up nice and neatly in a bow, right? I do think that the White House is going to push back on his ability and his authority. I think that they're going to say that he has sweeping authority. Of course, it's in the Constitution that says he doesn't. And it also says in the separation of powers doctrine that the president may not, by issuing an executive order, usurp the lawmaking powers of Congress. So I think if they lean on those tenets, that it will be successful. I think it will be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think at the end of the day, and again, we have to acknowledge that the Supreme Court is a bit of a toss-up. Like, we don't know which way they're going to go, because yes, I'm seeing in the separation of powers doctrine, I'm seeing in the zone of twilight, and I'm seeing in the Constitution where it explicitly spells out the limitations of his power. But we also saw when they did immunity, those things were also explicitly laid out in the Constitution. And there was a very different interpretation coming out of the Supreme Court. And I think that's what we might be up against here. I think there might be room for a different interpretation. I don't see how. I think it's very, very clear. And I think the zone of twilight is very, very clear. I think there's really not much of an interpretation that can be made there. I think it's very to the point, and I think it's very powerful when it says that he's at his lowest rung of power when he disagrees with Congress. I think that's a very powerful thing. And if they include that in their complaint or any responses, they will, I think they'll be successful. It's going to be really interesting to see how it goes, but I would bet my money on that complaint prevailing and it being thrown out, because if you just look at the zone of twilight, the separation of powers, and the Constitution, you've got three sources that you can point to that show, in instances that are very specific to this instance, that he is on shaky ground at best. And then you've got very clear wording that says he can't usurp the power of Congress, which is in effect what he's trying to do. So they could argue that by using the separation of powers doctrine, you can't undo what Congress has done. And Congress has appropriated the funds. You can't unappropriate them just because you don't like the programs that they're working for. I would think they would say, now, next budget, is he free to do whatever he wants in terms of the budget? I mean, yeah, that they all are, right? But this has already been done and dusted. It's decided. You can't undo it. Like, you can't put the genie back in the box. The funds have been appropriated. They've been disseminated to the agencies. The agencies have disseminated them to their programs. The state and states have disseminated them to their programs. Like, you cannot undo all that has been done now, because Congress has decided this is how these funds are going to be allocated, right? We've appropriated them to these programs. These programs have then turned around and disseminated the funds to their recipients. You cannot undo this now. So it will be really interesting to see what he says. The response so far has been a little lackluster. They're kind of saying, well, this is moot because the memo was rescinded. But I think whether it's rescinded or not, it's still a kind of real and present danger, right? Because you've got the press secretary on one hand saying just the memo was rescinded, but the policy is in full effect. And then you've just also got just the power of suggestion, the implied authority is making people do things that I don't think they normally would. Not to mention that there is an entire procurement act, right? Like, there are policies and procedures that govern procurement, and this is trying to supersede all of them. So it will be interesting to see what comes up. That's my 2 cents. Thanks for listening.